Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. As Director of Lectures and Seminars, it's always my privilege to be the first to welcome everyone to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website. I would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to see that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. It is always a courtesy most appreciated. We will post the program on the Heritage website as well for your future reference. And of course, our internet viewers are welcome at any time to send questions or comments, which we'll be glad to feature for the speakers, to our email address, which is speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our discussion today is Derek Morgan. Mr. Morgan is Vice President for Domestic and Economic Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. He is a lawyer by training. He has served in all three branches of the government, including the most recent case of senior staff for Vice President Richard Cheney just before joining us here at Heritage. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Derek Morgan. Derek?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you all for being here. You are the hardy soul of the country, making it out in this weather to find out what can we do to turn America around. So thank you very much for doing that. And of course, always want to thank those who are watching online as well, joining us too. Well, you have in front of you, I think, what promises to be an enlightening conversation with two very distinguished authors. Dr. Tim Kaine is an economist and research fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Previously, he was the chief economist at the Hudson Institute here in Washington. He's held senior research roles at the Kauffman Foundation and also here at the Heritage Foundation. Kaine has also served twice as a senior economist at the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress. Dr. Kim Holmes was Heritage's Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies and Director of the Davis Institute for International Studies from 1991 to 2012, except for his service during most of the first term of President George W. Bush as Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. Kim was a founding editor of the Heritage Foundation and Wall Street Journal publication, The Index of Economic Freedom, which Tim actually also was a lead author on that publication as well. So we are here today because the future strength of America is in real doubt. Like I just mentioned, both of these authors have had a role in the Index of Economic Freedom over the years, and that index has recorded declines in freedom for the United States every year since Tim Kaine was the lead editor in 2007. There's no correlation there. It's purely coincidence. We're the only nation to decline 7 years in a row, as a matter of fact. Both have written warnings and fascinating books. Tim's balanced the economics of great powers from ancient Rome to modern America, and Kim's Rebound, getting America back to great. I'm so glad that neither book is all gloom and no hope, however. In fact, these books have some common answers to what ails America. Both note the importance of limited and impartial government and private property, for example. The books do have different emphasis, though. Tim is a PhD in economics and approaches his book through the lens of comparative productivity, growth, and the size of the economy of the world's great powers. And Kim, a PhD in history, has more emphasis on culture and history of one great power, the United States of America. Tim's book looks at the great powers as diverse as Rome, the Ottoman Empire, Japan, and Britain. It ends with some lessons from those great powers that America should learn in our current circumstance. Kim focuses on America, tracing our development since 1776 and encouraging us to learn from our own history of what worked. Together, they give us a great picture, I think, of our current state and what we need to do. As patriots and lovers of all mankind, we all want to see our nation, which has done more to support liberty around the world than any other, remain the greatest power in the world for many years to come. We're all privileged here, I think, to hear today from our learned guests how that can happen. So we're going to start with Tim Kaine, and then we're going to hear from Kim Holmes, and we'll have plenty of time for question and answer. With that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guests.
So I guess I was told we're going to do bad cop, good cop. So I'm going to tell you why everything's terrible and you're all in big trouble, and then yeah. Oh, no. Well, listen, it's really an honor to be back, Derek. Thanks for having me here. So I did work here. Gosh, the years melt away. A few years ago, and there are some old friends still here. But Heritage, part of the genius that Ed Fulner and Phil Trulock did in establishing this place was there's a huge alumni network around town. And so it's always interesting when the foundation comes in the news and there'll be a scholar here that will take a position out, and it will be a little bit different from a position I took. So the reporters will call and say, "What's going on with the Heritage Foundation?" I got a lot of those calls about immigration recently because there's a report that came out from a former colleague of mine who's still here, and I'd written something different. And it's so funny because I would talk to reporters and say all the great things about the vision of Heritage as a big tent organization, and those I don't think ever saw print. That wasn't the kind of quotes the media was generally looking for. So it's nice to now be here at the podium and be able to say it. That notion of diversity of thought and that people can love their country and actually have a lot of ideas in common and be both essentially conservative and still disagree is something that's been very well understood in this building for a long time. And it doesn't seem to be understood, unfortunately, in the media and sometimes in America. That's actually a big part of why Glenn and I wanted to write this book. And I'll get to it in the conclusion of my remarks. But before I get any further, I'm going to note it's February 14th, Valentine's Day. I know it has been difficult to come here with the weather and the fact it's Valentine's Day. And in fact, my wife wanted to join us, and her roommate's not able to be here. And to join us for lunch, so that's too bad. I miss her, honey. Happy Valentine's Day if you're out there watching. But my wife is from Tokyo. We met when I was in the U.S. military. She'd been an exchange student to Texas, but gone back and worked there, so trilingual, French, English. But she's an immigrant to this country, a green card holder to this day. And so a bit of an inside joke here, but from this podium, Heritage Hearts Immigrants. But we do, and I think that's been the position for a long time. It's how do you get policy right to keep this nation continuing as a nation of immigrants. And Kim, I remember another book you wrote a few years ago. I think you made a point of having the Statue of Liberty on the cover to sort of emphasize that theme. So it is really nice to be back and to talk about ideas. And I don't know exactly where Kim and I will disagree. I know a lot of areas we do, but I like the diversity of thought, and so let's get to it. Now, the book Balance. Part of this book is an effort to contribute some original thinking. There's been a conversation, and I guess you'd call it the national security literature, about the balance of power for, gosh, it must be over a century, 2 centuries, going back to the Europeans and their sense of a balance of power on the continent. And as an economist, and forgive us, we tend to think that we run the world, or at least our ideas do. We think there's a balance of economics that's the foundation of the balance of power. And if you get the economics right, then the power will take care of itself. Now, when Glenn and I decided to write this book, we were coming up on the 25th anniversary of Paul Kennedy's book, Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which was a sensation for a history book that was something like 800 pages long, chock full of charts and graphs, mostly economic. That was one of the underlying points that he made. One is that economic strength is the foundation of political and military strength, and the other is that relative economic strength is really the yardstick. And we endorsed both those ideas, but Glenn and I really disagreed, and we disagreed when we were younger men and read Kennedy, with the idea that the United States would suffer from what he called imperial overstretch. That's really probably not the right way to think about these things, and we don't think history's borne out his warnings that Europe would surpass us, that the Soviet Union would remain a threat, and that Japan was sort of catapulting ahead of, if not already ahead of, the United States. History's proven a lot of those ideas wrong. But let's return to the fundamentals of economic strength and what is power. That's the main contribution we tried to make, I think, intellectually with this book. We came up with a metric of power that I'll try to get across in an anecdote. So we all read about China, the rising threat of China. It reminds, I think, Kim and I about the rising threat of Japan from 20, 25 years ago. Another Asian power, they had growth rates that were double digits, whereas the United States productivity rate per capita terms is about 2% a year, and it has been for decades and decades. 10% versus 2% can seem pretty intimidating. But we've also seen that metric, if you remember the 1960s and 70s, when we were warned by thinkers in the CIA, and in fact the leading textbook in the United States, Economics by Paul Samuelson, multiple editions over multiple decades. The very first chart in the first textbook that most people studied when they studied economics, showed the growth rate of the United States and the growth rate of the Soviet Union. And it showed that the Soviet Union's total GDP was going to surpass the United States about 15 years in the future. So the funny thing is, even though that textbook was going through multiple editions, over 30 years, it was always 15 years in the future. So there's something about projecting growth rates into the future, and then the growth rates don't seem to keep up. Now, when I hear about something that's growing at 10% a year and is a threat to my future, the first thing that comes to my mind is my 7-year-old daughter, who's, her weight gain is about 10% per year. And I'm not really worried that she's going to take over the world, except for that 16, 17-year time frame when she's in high school. But that too shall pass, I'm told. Growth rates depend entirely on the baseline number, right? What's the initial GDP? And I think most people that aren't economists will tell you, even if you have a big GDP, it may be a function of having a big population. You need to look at the technological prowess, the GDP per capita. So Glenn and I want to emphasize a measure of economic power that combines those three things. And that's what we do. And I think part of the reason that we can caution the United States doesn't have a lot to fear economically from anyone. And that's a big claim. And we make it a big claim. We know it's a bit of a stretch claim, but we make it on purpose. And in fact, we think the way to think about if there's one existential threat facing America, if you look at the economic power numbers and the likely projections 20 years from now, the economic power of the United States will remain unsurpassed. It's very hard to imagine a scenario, even a crash, that will bring America to its knees and let another country catapult past. So that's the good news. 20 years from now, we should be fine. 21 years from now, all bets are off. But this is what's happened, though, in history so many times. So we wanted to look at Rome, which didn't decline in a 20-year period or a 50-year period. It was multiple centuries from their peak power to where they finally exhausted themselves with bad policy decision after bad policy decision. And that's true of the Ottoman Empire, and it's true to some extent of the British Empire. We caveat that because we're not sure the British Empire ever really fell. But they weakened. They maybe strayed from their core principles of free trade and openness. Ming China, many consider the greatest power on earth for maybe 500 or 1,000 years. Some people say the Chinese should have been where industrialization happened, but they fumbled. And so you look at what are the policies that take centuries long to fell a great empire or a great civilization. And it's usually these. One, they move away from a federal structure, where ancient Rome had different areas. They had different governors that were very powerful. And they had different policies and flexibility. And slowly over time, that was all centralized. Two is you see that centralized power, usually historically in one person, but they'll surround themselves with an administration, a bureaucracy, and an inner circle of guardians, the Praetorian Guard. And that Praetorian Guard almost always gets corrupted, right? It almost always starts to become self-serving. So we see that in the Ottomans with the Janissary Corps. And we see these patterns again and again of centralization, then a central bureaucracy that becomes self-dealing, over-regulation, and ultimately they move into things like price controls to stabilize the economy. So you're reminded of these things when you hear about raising the minimum wage. Really? Idaho can't set their own minimum wage that's different from Manhattan? Like they're just not reliable or trustable? So little things like a national takeover of healthcare, national solutions to every little problem, new departments. And to us, the Department of Education and the Department of Energy seem like they're old because they've been around for a few decades. But in historical time, when historians 1,000 years from now look back, it's a blink of an eye between 1950 and 2050. And so much has changed. And we're in the process of it. It's our generation that will either let this centralization continue, and then maybe a century or two from now, we follow Rome, or we try to fight back. We try to remember what are the first principles. I'm going to touch on this issue of immigration just a little bit, because interestingly, when Glenn and I wanted to think about the other great powers, we wanted to sort of have one that's representative of every region of the world. And we thought about the Middle East. What was the great power from the Middle East? And we think the Ottomans are pretty clearly it. A great Islamic power. And when you hear talk of the Middle East rising again, the caliphate being centralized. That's the model that maybe some nationalist Islamists would look to. But the irony is, the Ottoman Empire, during its growth phase, during its expansionary phase, was very open to other religions. In fact, when the Jews were kicked out, essentially, of Spain and tortured and had their property stolen, they went to one of two places. They went to Northern Europe, generally to Holland, or they went to Turkey, right, the seat of the Ottoman Empire, which was very open. All religions were treated equally. You could be a Jew, you could be a Christian, you could be a Muslim. The law in the Ottoman Empire treated you as equal. When that changed, and it did change, when the Sunnis felt a need to show their purity to rival the Persians and the Shia, they started to contract, and they started to be less open to foreigners. So there's a historical lesson of being a nation of immigrants and embracing that heritage and maintaining that heritage, which we can see in other empires that have fallen. And to turn that lesson a little bit to the British, I'm always afraid that if I talk about great power and I avoid Britain, that I'm being cowardly. Britain ruled the seas of the earth, and they dominated at least a quarter, controlled a quarter of the landmass and about a quarter of the world's population. 25% of the world's population being citizens. But wait, that's the point. They weren't citizens. They were subjects of England. So when we ask, why did England decline, here in Washington, D.C., what an ironic question. Imagine if they'd granted citizenship to the United States, right, to the people of the colonies here, which the Prime Minister of England was arguing for, William Pitt the Elder. He wasn't Prime Minister at the time, which Adam Smith argues for in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Right? It's a book we all know about, but do we recognize that in that book it calls for the people of the U.S., the people of North America, to be given British citizenship? And the powers that be ignored that. They were very protective of what they thought was their special citizenship, and they lost the United States. Now, ironically, later on, they adopted, there was a history in Britain of being open to peoples outside of their core, to Scotland, to parts of Ireland, but not to North America and not to India. And what a terrible mistake it was. So they didn't decline, but they were surpassed. And I think America really needs to challenge itself to remember those lessons, and especially when they're cute Japanese girls, to be open to immigrants. So we conclude the book talking about politics, but besides economic decline, it's usually these political stories, right? This bureaucracy that gets empowered. And when we turn our lens to America and we see the flaws here, I think we agree with everybody in the United States who said we're tired of the hyper-partisanship of Washington, D.C. And I find it somewhat ironic that the finger often gets pointed to Heritage or Heritage Action, where my old friend Mike Needham works. Wait a minute. The stories I read about the conservative movement are about we're at war with ourselves, and there's all these strong disagreements, that we've had this diversity of thought. But in a democracy, you want a diversity of opinion. Now, as an economist, when I see a failing system, politically, it's usually a monopoly of power, a monopoly of political power. Or in the United States, what we think has happened is there's been a duopoly. And what happens in a duopoly is you've got entrenched interests. Like let's imagine the car industry, the auto industry. And I'm not making a claim here. I'm just trying to draw an image. That maybe is 3 big competitors. And what those 3 big competitors will do in any monopolistic competition is they'll try to get politics to provide a shield that will prevent new entrants, that will prevent entrepreneurs from challenging them. That will last for a decade or two, but eventually from outside of that industry, something new will come. Maybe it will be software or a personal computer that will challenge the old guard, right? The big mainframes. In politics, there's no recourse, though. It's sort of a closed environment. And what happened is we have a natural 2-party system in the United States. But it doesn't have to be these 2 parties. What concerns Glenn and I, and what we've analyzed, is in the 1970s, there were laws passed that said money was corrupting politics, and therefore money would be taken out of politics. Well, not really taken out, but it would be controlled by the 2 things that we could really trust, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So if Terry decides he wants to run for Senate, and he's got new ideas, but they don't really fit well with either party, the maximum he can raise is $1,000 from any individual. Now, that same individual, if he wanted to give $34,000 to one of the two parties would be perfectly legal. But to give $34,000 to an entrepreneurial candidate, that's against the law. In a country that says it values freedom of speech and the First Amendment, it's bizarre to have found ourselves in this place, to have lost track of our first principles. What makes Glenn and I hopeful is the Supreme Court has finally decided, after 30 years of increasing partisanship with this protected monopoly, that it's time for more competition in our politics. It's time for a diversity of thought. And so to see the conservative movement ridiculed for having diversity, for having people go outside the party line, I think is a bit hypocritical. And it's time for the media to recognize we're early in this process of a diversity and freedom for outside groups, outside the Republican and Democratic monopolies, to bring some entrepreneurial ideas. So we think it's good news. We think the Supreme Court's on the right path with this, and that things are going to settle down, and we'll see some entrepreneurs rise again that will maybe help us get beyond the stagnant politics of the last 30 years. So we're hopeful, and I think now, Kim, you're going to make us even more hopeful. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Derek, for inviting me and inviting all of us here to talk about our books. It's great to see you again, Tim. Tim was a co-editor of the Index of Economic Freedom for a few years, and he introduced a couple of innovations, particularly on the business side, that Terry, we decided to keep because it was so good. So we always, all of our editors always ended up improving the index. You did a fantastic job when you were here, and it's great to see you again. What I'd like to do is, first of all, I want to start off by saying, do we have a copy of his book? This is, I'm going to do I have my own book here, but I'm going to do an advertisement for his. This is a very important book, and I encourage all of you to read it. It's important not only because it takes an historical perspective on the rise and falls of great powers and the economics behind it, but also because as the message that you're basically providing is, if we can't learn from our mistakes and we can't learn from what worked and what didn't work, we cannot possibly find a way forward. This is a similar attack I took in my book, Rebound, Getting America Back to Great. I'm trying to learn from the American experience, what worked and what didn't, so we can apply those lessons to our future. Now, since I've discussed the contents of my book a couple of times already here at Heritage, what I thought I'd do was take up Tim and Glenn's idea of balance or imbalance, as the case may be, and apply it not just to the economics, the economic history of the United States, but also to other aspects of America's development over the years and the rise as a great nation. What I argue in my book, Rebound, is that it's actually the interplay, or the balance, if you will, between certain characteristics of the American system that accounts for America's success. It was how the culture, the government, and the law were enablers for the economy, but also how, in turn, the economic and political systems fed and nurtured the American culture, the social and the value systems. It was about how a wealthy and privileged man like Thomas Jefferson could become a champion of the common man, but also how a relatively small, poor or small-town boy like Harlow Curtis could rise in the 1950s to be the head of General Motors and also be the highest-paid executive in the world. Now, you can see here somewhat of a paradox, at least in terms of class and social status. But the amazing thing is that it all worked. As I say in Rebound, America was a land in which the rich pretended to be commoners and the commoners aspired to be rich. Now, it worked for most of our history because there was a positive and dynamic interaction between three key characteristics of the American system. One was the ethos of personal responsibility. The second was a constitutionally limited government, which, because of our federal system, put much of the actual reach of the law at the state and local levels for most of our history. And third, of course, the free market system. Think of the American system as a fabric, and each of these individual characteristics as special designs weaved into that fabric. Each of had its own design, but the overall effect on the fabric as a whole is a completely different design. In other words, the total is far greater than the sum of its parts. And that, in my estimation, is the essence of American exceptionalism and the key to American greatness. Now, I agree that all of this is true even through the progressive era and the rise of the New Deal. Even as the size of the federal government expanded in these years, there was still a sufficient resilience, if you will, in both the cultural value system, but also the size of the private economy and how it interacted with government to prevent the basic system from completely getting out of balance. It was not until the 60s and the 70s, with the rise of the entitlement state, the welfare state, and I argue, as I'll say in a few minutes, also the rise of the counterculture and the New Left, that the current imbalances that we talk about and that you talk about in your book start to surface. Now, I happen to think that Tim and Glenn are spot on their analysis of the economics of great powers, and I think they are right that the central problem facing America today is the uncontrollable fiscal imbalance that's perpetuated by a broken political system. But let me add a couple of other factors to the picture that I take from my book. So let me start, for example, with institutions, which you talk about a great deal. They are absolutely, absolutely crucial. They are the products of the government system, but also of the law. And in this respect, the tradition of limited government was critical in our history. A light regulatory touch combined with a respect for entrepreneurship were incentives to building the institutions of a free market system. In other words, the financial credit and investment institutions of the economic miracle of America. Labor and capital were able to flow where they were most needed. Productivity mattered because profits mattered. An entire continent was settled, and this remarkable system of government would never have happened. We would never have the enormous wealth that emerged if it were not for this remarkable system of government. But also critical was the American approach to the law. It was not only fiercely protective of private property, it was not only, for most of our history, largely local, it also provided the stability and predictability necessary for the growth of the economy. It allowed capital to accumulate, which created financial investment markets. Now, when combined with the light regulatory touch that I mentioned earlier, this approach to the law allowed for an enormous wealth creation. The economic system was flexible. It was not static, it was not mercantilist, as it often was in Europe, where productivity often took a back seat to the need of the government to maintain social and political control over the economy and over the people. Now, it is true that the U.S. economy exploded in the 20th century when the role of government in the economy also expanded. And some conclude that because of this, government activism must have played a crucial role in the rise of the American economy. And I say in the book, be careful about this. There were other factors involved besides the growth of government. These included the advancing technology, which created new machines, new products, and new markets. There was also a tremendous growth of populations as the industrial age improved health and other qualities of life. Those people became consumers and they became laborers. And there was also the rise of a global trade, which opened up new markets and spurred a rise in productivity. So for most of our history, government and the law existed largely to protect private property and to facilitate the workings of the private economy. And even the growth of the government in the 20th century, I would say the growth of the economy in the 20th century occurred in spite of the growth of government, not because of it. Now, all of this started to change, particularly in the late 20th century, with the rise of what some call the administrative state, centralized administrative state. And of course, over time, a sort of hyperactive administrative state sought to regulate the outcomes of the economy, largely for political reasons, which inherently meant that you were, or the government was, limiting private property. Now, these developments had, in my opinion, a devastating effect on our ability to solve the fiscal and debt crises that we face today and that you talk about in your book, Tim. And there's two reasons why I say this. One is that these changes that occurred removed the moral foundations of economic freedom in our culture. In other words, the idea that private ownership is as much a right as life or liberty. Now, one reason why it is so hard politically to argue that taking from the rich to give to the poor is an injustice is because many Americans no longer believe that property and economic freedom are rights equally enjoyed by all Americans, regardless of wealth and regardless of class. Now, there's been another consequence. These changes have allowed collective and corporate interests, you talk about these in your book, Tim, which the government once strove to guard against, Today, they organize themselves into governmental, you call them rent-seeking, dependent parties. The government favors these economic interests, supposedly in the name of the public good, but their benefits remain private and limited to specific groups who enjoy specific political favor. So the government can sue a private bank, company, or association, even if doing so is favoring one private interest over another. It can subsidize one company at the expense of another private company. And certainly it can tax one citizen in order to provide benefits to another. No longer seeing its role as a facilitator of the private economy and as a protector of private property, there is precious little that the government today cannot do in the name of economic equality and social justice. Now, there are lots of reasons why it's difficult to convince Americans that a runaway debt is bad for the economy. But what I'm trying to argue here is that one of the reasons is that the lines between public and private interest, between public and private rights, has been blurred as a result of these changes in attitudes about government and the economy over the last 60 or 70 years. This has created a lot of lazy ideas, frankly, about the economy. For example, it's commonplace for many Americans to believe that the economy, putting quotations around that, belongs to all of us, as if it's collective property, or as if it's a collective property of the nation, which is often, of course, in turn equated with the government. In other words, it's not the sum total of private decisions and private actions, but the collective action of the nation as a whole. That's what the economy sometimes is seen as by many Americans. And if that's so, if you have that attitude, if you assume that, that's why it's so easy for politicians to assume that the government has a certain claim over your income, almost as if your income is a property right of the government, because the wealth of the nation is assumed to be the collective property of the nation. Now, for 200 years, that was not how Americans viewed the economy, and it certainly wasn't the way most Americans looked at the role of the government in the economy. Now, let me turn to my second observation, my second addition to why America has performed well in the past, but why it's not doing so well today. In the book, I talk about the influence of American culture on the rise of the United States as a great nation. I talk about what I call the ethos of personal responsibility that emerged early in our history to, quote, tame the wild horses of the free market economy, to not only make the economy work better, but also to give the aspiration to work and to get rich a higher moral purpose than simply accumulating wealth. The worth ethic of deferred gratification, which was frankly engendered a lot in our history by religion, combined with values of cooperation and association that defined the kind of unique ways Americans looked at civil society. These values contributed not only to the rise of a stable democracy, but to decades of economic growth. But, as with the economy, something happened in the 1960s and the 1970s. At the same time the Great Society spawned the growth of the welfare state, a cultural shift occurred in America. It was the beginning of the counterculture, the rise of the new left, and if you look at it in political terms, which was a shift away from old, rugged virtues of individual responsibility toward the more self-centered personal values of what was called the 1970s, the me generation. It was no longer shameful to be dependent on others, regardless of effort. The old worth ethic of the past 200 years gave way to a new narrative of personal liberation, which put the focus culturally, psychologically, and even economically on one's needs rather than on one's obligations. Now, I have to be careful here. I admit this. There are still plenty of Americans who don't think this way today, so don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to paint the entire nation this way, but sadly, there are millions of Americans who do think this way to this day. And frankly, they are not all poor people. The entitlement mentality is creeping into the value system of the American middle class and has been for years. It is admittedly complex insofar as, for example, most elderly people do not see Social Security and Medicare as strictly entitlement programs, but it is hard to escape the conclusion that increasingly middle-class Americans are joining lower-income Americans and expecting the government to make their lives easier, regardless of the cost and regardless of who is paying for it. Now, Tim and Glenn provide, I think, a brilliant analysis of why America is so polarized today. You talked about campaign finance reform, but other things as well. They arguing about the limits being put on free speech. But there's another reason, in my opinion. The more the values of the counterculture have come to dominate, the more divided the nation has become. It's not just politics, it's not just economics, it's also culture. Our culture wars are manifested almost daily by controversies over some supposedly insensitive remark that somebody makes. I only need to mention 2 words for you to know what I'm talking about: Duck Dynasty. These cultural divisions are feeding our political divisions. They are creating social political camps that divide along lines of religion, class, ethnicity, and gender, all of which serve to grow the size of the state as a means to adjudicate the differences between these groups. The goal is first, of all these groups, is first to capture the government, but most importantly to capture the law. After that, everything is only a matter of execution, which may explain why President Obama's penchant for pens and phones. My point is that regardless of all the economic debates about the size of the debt and the size of government, the culture wars also grow the size of government, even inadvertently, and even if they have nothing whatsoever to do with economics. Now, I raise all these points not because I have any easy answers. I did scores of radio interviews after my book was published, and almost everyone was interested in this cultural angle more so than anything else I raised. And they would inevitably ask me at the end of the interview, okay, I agree with you, it's a terrible thing, what do you do about it? And that's when it starts getting really complicated. But here's what my answer was, as I boiled it down to what it would be in a radio interview, which was not a lot of time. I say, do what the New Left did. Do what the New Left did starting in the 1950s and the 60s. Be better at the culture, at popular culture, at intellectual life, and even in the arts and the entertainment than everyone else is, particularly those on the left. Manifest your worldview in the most interesting ways in the media, but also in politics and society. And march through the institutions as the New Left did starting in the 1960s, the universities, the churches, the business community, the arts and entertainment industry, and in local community institutions. Politics is ultimately always downstream from culture. If you want to control the former, in the long run, you've got to do something about the former. It's really hard to do, but if you only focus on politics, we're always going to be chasing things. Thank you.
All right, well, we do have time for questions. I've got a couple, but I'll be thinking about your own questions too. So first, Tim, is there anything you wanted to respond to in Kim's remarks, maybe in particular on cronyism, which I know you talk about in your own book, but Kim kind of settled on a little bit more. But anything else you want to talk about, Tim?
Well, I like the cultural angle a lot, and I was looking for things in Kim's remarks to disagree with for your benefit, and there's not a lot there, but I think he brings a perspective that we don't, and economists are usually shy to talk about culture, right? It's not an easy thing to quantify, but it doesn't mean it's not real, and I think this sense of entitlement and versus responsibility versus the work ethic, it's something that we can trace, and it's very hard to know what to do about. Let me just focus a little bit on workforce participation rates. Teen workforce participation rates, I think, Kim, we talked about this when I was here. I came into your office and was excited because the data had showed that the teen workforce participation rates had collapsed over like a 12-month period. And they have been going down for decades, but it was this last recession, and after the 9/11 attacks, we started to get the data. We saw that fewer and fewer teens were going into the workforce to get that first job, to learn some of those non-cognitive skills that are so important, to be responsible, to buy their own music or whatnot. But the little side note is whenever I get to be with Kim, I remember when we first started to work together and got to know each other, for this man to talk about culture, you should know that he's actually pretty darn good with the guitar. Oh. And I think if we have a rebound of some real rock and roll, then we'll get this country back on the right
That's the part of counterculture I'd like to exempt. You know, it did pretty well.
So
not the lifestyles, but the music.
I had to say it, Kim. But you know, I think he's right. If we could rock again as a country, we'll be just fine. But there is that concern that kids in addition to being into music, they're not working. They're just not working as much. And I think parents have a responsibility. I see it in my community. When we were young, our parents would tell us to go outside, find something to do. Whereas now, my wife and I are sort of expected to shuttle the kids everywhere. It has to be a safe environment. It's got to, the schools are gated. And I understand that instinct to protect. But in a large sense, what Kim's pointing to is the role of a politician is not to protect the people. It's to secure their freedom and to let them do with that freedom what they will. The idea of it's still a free country. And the notion that it's a free country in transition troubles me just as much as Kim, and I think he really put his finger on that cultural marker.
Yeah, well, I just jumping off of that, I don't know who else is sore from shoveling snow yesterday. I am, but I did require my nearly 10-year-old to come and help me shovel the sidewalks, including for the neighbors. So, all right, why don't we go here in the front? Wait, if you can wait for a microphone, and also just let us know if you have an affiliation as well.
Milton Grenfell, just a fellow American.
Great.
Do either of your books talk about the increasingly legalization of our culture? You mentioned hiring teenagers. I mean, nowadays you're afraid to hire anybody. Can you fire them? What do you have to pay them? What are the insurance risks? I mean, do they have workman's comp? I mean, it's just, there's such liability and about raising children. I mean, it's extraordinary now. People are so afraid of being sued. Mm-hmm. Other cultures really don't even know what this is. We have this burden of litigation that is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. Do your books talk about that?
Well, I'll say that I think working on the index with Kim, and he's authored many editions of the index. I really just worked on the one in 2007 and then helped a little in 2008. But it kind of opened my eyes to thinking of these 10 freedoms as one comprehensive score of economic freedom. You get a lot of people that will oversimplify the conversation about freedom. And they'll say, well, there's the European model, which is less free, but they seem to be doing well, and they'll point out Scandinavian countries. And there's the American cowboy capitalism model. In fact, there are at least 3 types of European economies. And it is something, we have a chart in Balance that shows the Nordic economies are the wealthiest and they're the freest. The central economies are the second most wealthy. They have been hovering, this is Germany, England, France. Their GDP per capita has hovered at about the 80% level if the U.S. defines the frontier, the highest GDP per capita country. And it's been that way for 50 years. That doesn't happen by accident. A country or an economy selects a set of macro institutions, and that determines essentially their relative income level. And then the southern European economies at about the 60% level. And when those countries try to live beyond their means and get into debt situations, that's Greece, that's Spain, that's Italy. And so this is almost predictable. You can see this happening 3-4 decades ahead of time. So we talk about it because the Nordic economies are seen as socialist. It's true they have high taxes, and it's true they tend to have bigger safety nets. But their regulatory freedoms are amazingly open and actually could teach the United States a thing or two, exactly to your point. And one of the things I was proudest of is when we revised the methodology of the index, we introduced labor freedom. It's something that Kim wanted to do, and we found some good data on it. And it showed how free those Nordic economies were. We don't want to go the path of the southern European economies and overprotect our kids and over-legalize what work is. And I think that's really starting to show the effects.
Yeah, I have a section in the book about, I go back and look at the history of American law. Of course, it rose out of the English common law tradition, but we put our particular stamp on it, not only because of our historical experience, even prior to the rise of the United States as a U.S. government, but particularly the way the constitutional system was overlaid on that. So in that period when I was talking about a limited government, sort of light hand of the government, the law, yes, it was largely local, but it was you could see a lot of litigious activity, but it was mainly over property rights and other kinds of things that the government was not directly involved in. So as the country changed, as the expectations of government changed, as law changed, as laws were passed to get greater into the social dimension of American life and economic life as the regulations were piled up, and then the law changed with it. And also, the cultural expectations we're talking about here, what teenagers view and the way Americans look at their families, the law will follow that too if it's given the possibility of doing it. One of the main points I made is that early on the law, prior to the rise of the 1960s and the 70s and the rise of the entitlement state, it was somewhat changed in the progressive era, but the law was largely conservative prior to this time. And it was working hand in hand with the values of an independent civil society and the economy. And it was working quite well. That's why I like this idea of balance. It was all in balance. It's now out of balance. Everything is out of balance. We've got a huge crushing debt. Our culture is working against productivity and also other things that are out of balance as well. And my point of my book is that it was those characteristics and that balance which made us a great nation, and we've got to find a way to get these things back in balance again.
Yeah, I'd quickly add as a lawyer. We had James Buckley, Judge Buckley, here at Heritage. He published a book called Freedom at Risk, and he talks about the mushrooming size of law, prescriptive law, and regulation. So on any given day, you might have 300 pages come out of the Federal Register. They just had one not that long ago. It was 50 pages on the display for your microwave oven. 50 pages. For most of this country, it was common law and common sense and so forth. It wasn't 50 pages about the display on your microwave. So to your point. All right, so another hand over here. We'll come back over this way.
Ray Hederman, Heritage. Let me defend a little bit of the youth of America. We're talking about their work ethic, but you haven't talked a little bit about policies we put in place that make it harder to employ young workers. A minimum wage, a lot more regulations from the state, and more importantly, last week the Congressional Budget Office came out and said the Affordable Care Act is going to dramatically reduce the supply of labor and make us a poorer country in the next 10 years. And the White House celebrated the fact that people will be working less. I mean, what type of message does that send? Is that how do you change that model and projections going forward?
That was an amazing thing to witness, and so I've joined the Hoover Institution recently, and I'm out in Palo Alto now at Stanford University. So when we think about the culture and that shift, that's been on my mind a bit. But being removed from D.C., some of the things that we get worked up about in this town just really don't matter outside of the Beltway. I think a lot of the machinations about the budget and is it going to be continued, it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. That one, though, is sort of a watershed study that the CBO put out. Now, those who remember when the ACA was being debated, it was the CBO's essentially endorsement that it would be budget reducing, or it would reduce the deficit, even though it would raise trillions of dollars of taxes and it would cost a little bit less than that. It would be net positive, so somehow that was a good thing. I think that can't be true anymore given all the exemptions and modifications. But this is a really key element that even then they recognized there were disincentives to work. And that is celebrated in the purest kind of spin as some kind of liberation for people. But if you've grown up in a poor household, and I wouldn't say that my mom and dad were poor, we were lower middle class probably, but I look at the number of shoes that a kid owns today and how many shoes I had. I was happy to have a pair of jeans without a hole in them, right? And I didn't think that was extraordinary. But work was something that was valued. I mean, you look forward to the chance to get your first job. And when the government, though, sets up a disincentive to work, if there's a single mom out there with 2 kids, and she values the fact that she brings home money to feed her kids and to clothe her kids, and suddenly the government's going to punish her, literally, they will take away more money from her in government programs than she can earn if she continues to work. It's not liberating. It's literally punishing work. We're talking about marginal tax rates of 10,000%. You make one more dollar, and you will lose tens of thousands of dollars of benefits. That's crazy. And to have a government that sets up these huge cliffs under the guise of means testing, which Obamacare has done, and our friends on the left who are, quietly working behind the scenes, they know this is bad policy. It was in a big rush, it was a gigantic bill, and somebody didn't tell the 20-year-old, don't set up a cliff that punishes work. And finally the CBO is caught up, and it's been exposed, and they're trying to spin that this was the design all along. It's a huge mistake, and it's going to hurt the country.
I think the thing that's remarkable about that story is, in fact, the spin on it. I don't really think that when they were designing Obamacare that they were sitting here thinking, well, how can I get 2 million jobs less? But when the story broke, they got, how am I going to explain this?
Yeah.
And so they fell on this narrative of liberation. And so my point is that where did that idea come from? And why wasn't it completely laughed out of the park? And it's because this larger cultural context, it's not laughed out of the park because over the last 60 years, there's been countless movies made about how dull working for a minimum wage is, and that this is not considered to be an honorable profession, that working hard and working your way up, this has been denigrated by Hollywood for decades. So we have become sensitive to the idea that anything you can do, regardless of what the cost is to someone else, to get yourself out of that dull kind of existence is okay. Because after all, that's perhaps the worst kind of punishment at all, is to be stuck in that kind of situation. And the fact that it sort of took off, or at least wasn't completely laughed out of the park, I think is a very telling thing.
I saw some hands on this side of the room. Let me go to the back first and then come forward.
Concerning the differences you mentioned between northern European countries and southern European countries as far as the economies, what would you say to the whole strand of thought that says that there are all these other deeper causes between them, differences in religion, the Catholic-Protestant split, differences in ethnicity, differences in it starts to get these more subtle attitudes towards, let's say, public corruption in Italy and Greece versus in the Scandinavian countries where there's a more moral tightness. These little subtle things, like in Germany, for instance, people, if there's a don't walk sign, people will actually not walk. I've never actually seen that until I was there, but, no cars coming, they still won't walk. There's a whole strand of these other causes that some people would say would inundate whatever you might want to do as far as economic reforms.
I've always been a little bit skeptical of the religious explanations for economic behavior, because I just think, I believe in the unity of mankind, that no matter where you go in the world, people love their children and they're going to work hard to make a better life for their children. But it's also because I'm pretty ignorant on religion. This is a kid who asked his father, so are we Catholic or are we Christian? And he's like, Tim, you just don't get it. And so it's not something that's been a huge priority. We'll go to church, we'll pray, but I never really understood all these differences, and I've seen how similar people can be. And I really do think that some of the incentive structures in place in law are the dominant factors. Now, good friends of mine, gosh, I remember one of the best weekends of my life were with a buddy of mine in the Air Force. His grandparents still lived in Greece. His parents were Greek immigrants, and we were in Athens for a weekend hanging out with his grandma and grandpa. And it was just, they're great people. But the government of Greece has really let the people down. And the government was the ones living beyond their means more than the people of Greece. So I don't think the cultural explanations don't matter when you've got governments bankrupting themselves and destroying the credit capability of the country. Now, on a positive note, I don't think the calamities happening in Southern Europe that may lead to some of these countries leaving the EU will hurt the EU. We have a lengthy analysis about where credit risk comes from. And the international credit market said, gee, all these countries are now using the same currency, we can charge them the same interest rate. That doesn't happen in the US. We've got 50 states, and each of those states raises, debt at different rates. And California's and in Illinois, it's getting kind of expensive, as it should. So the world markets had to learn that lesson, that because they have the same currency doesn't mean they're the same credit risk. That's a lesson you only have to learn once. So it doesn't I'm more confident now about the future of the EU and its strength, and hopefully they can find that fine line of what things to unify that can strengthen and what things to diversify to allow experimentation, like with labor regulation.
You know what? If you look at the history of the work ethic in America, most people talked about it early on as the Protestant work ethic. That was the way it was discussed. And there's a lot of controversy over that. But I think the best way of seeing it, what may have started out as a sort of a view of the world of people who happen to be Protestants, and also what started out as a system of law and government which early on was largely British, through this experience, the American experience became something entirely different, not only in substance, but also in the way it was mixed together, that would have no bearing whatsoever or reflection whatsoever of the original so-called religious ideas. Take, for example, you ever wondered why so many people from Boston or Massachusetts are secular liberals, very liberal people? Why is it that happened? And it's obviously, like most things in history, it's complicated, and a lot of things are involved in that. But it probably has something to do with the fact, if you go back far enough in Massachusetts history, the old Puritan ethic, which had been once religious, was transferred over into certain political ideologies. So it completely lost its religious roots and became something different, but the ethic was still there. What does that mean? My point is that we should not get hung up in identifying cultures too much with ethnicity or even with religions per se, because they change over time, because that's been our experience here. Maybe it's more fixed in Europe. I don't really want to answer your question about that because it's more complicated there. But in the experience that we're talking about here, it's a lot more flexible.
All right, so another question over here. Is that you, Emily? Yeah.
I'm Emily Goff, here at the Heritage Foundation. We obviously are, a lot of us, in policy and in politics here, and messaging is key. So in your experience, what are the kind of phrases, or what are the succinct messages that you think are the most persuasive, the most, that kind of resonate the most in communicating these findings and these ideas that you guys have?
You know, well, gosh, that's a great question, and maybe one we could have more of a conversation about, because I'd like to hear your thoughts. But we thought the phrase balance was really important, the word balance, and it has a historical resonance with the balance of politics, balance of power, pardon me. But we heard, you know, President Obama talk about not being far right or far left. We need to come to the center. We need to have a balanced approach to fixing the budget deficit. Now, his language, I think, was effective. His policies, I thought, were not matching that language. But Glenn and I actually wrote in the book, and I think we had an op-ed, that balance doesn't necessarily mean you give half, I give half. It means a lot of times they'll think, oh, when you talk about politics, it's left versus right. Well, as Kim points out, something that we see eye to eye, the imbalance now is federal-local. You would probably be hard-pressed to have a conversation with 10 Americans and have them think about what real sovereignty they had at a local level, that the federal government just shouldn't be involved in. And that's where I like to bring up the minimum wage. I really can't understand why we would distrust the 50 states, because they can set their own speed limits. We've given them back that authority here in D.C. They can tell their people how fast to drive, but not what wage to work at or what price limit. So that, to me, I think is a good phrase to use and build from. And I like to emphasize diversity of thought a lot, because it makes people really open their eyes to realize, you know, the party line that I think you see out of the left and you see more unity isn't necessarily a healthy development. That's maybe imbalanced. But it's, you know, messaging, I think, is something that Heritage has tended to do very well. They have a great team here in the media shop. And so it's been part of a really interesting conversation. I learned a lot when I was here about that.
I think we have to figure out ways to recover what I would call unhyphenated American ideals. Liberals are very good at taking the long ideals of justice, equality, and freedom and either changing their meaning or putting an adjective in front of them to change their meaning. You know, social justice as opposed to justice. You know, positive freedom as opposed to freedom. And they do it conceptually, and then they work their messages out of those concepts. So it's not as if it has no intellectual grounding what they're talking about. And I think that one way we can do it as conservatives is recapture the meanings of what justice is and what equality really is. And it's, we don't have anything to apologize. We believe in equality before the law, for example. And we don't necessarily believe in economic equality, but we do believe in equality. And we do believe in justice, not justice in the sense of the legal sense, but also even in the sense that there's something unjust about taking from one person and giving, particularly if that person's not working, and giving something to somebody else if they are. There's something unjust about that, and not just in the kind of strict legal sense. And that's it's not only a positive narrative, if you will, to use the language of the media people, but it's also the truth. And it works really well when those two things are together.
That's a good note to end on. We've unfortunately reached the end of our time, but I do want to remind everyone that the books are available, that John's holding up right there, are available outside, and I'm sure the authors would be happy to sign them. Sure. And please join me in thanking our panelists.